We're in Genesis 22 this morning, finishing up our time with Abraham. There's a couple more chapters that could fit with either Abraham or Isaac. We'll put them with Isaac. But we are finishing up Abraham. Next week we will start a new series on the book of Hebrews. I'm really looking forward to that. Evan is going to be taking a good chunk of those sermons as well over the summer, so he's going to get to do 4 weeks in a row. I'm going to be here for most of those weeks, but he's going to be preaching 4 sermons in a row because that's when you really learn how to preach, when the next Sunday's coming, whether you want it to or not. And so we're looking forward to that. Well, at least I'm looking forward to that. When the jury's out on whether Evan's looking forward to that or not. And you guys will decide about week 3 whether you're looking forward to it or not. No, I think it'll be a great month of June for us as a church family. But today we're going to be in Genesis chapter number 22. Genesis 22. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. Go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servant, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. He himself carried the fire and the knife as the 2 of them went on together. Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said. "But where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. They reached the place God had told him about. Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, "The Lord will provide." To this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on the earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." Then Abraham returned to his servants. They set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. This text, we are told that Abraham is facing a test. That's the word that is actually used in the text, that Abraham is being tested. Now, does Abraham know that he's being tested? I'm sure he has some questions about why this would be happening. It must be a test of some sort. But God does not explain the whole story to Abraham from the beginning. In this way, it kind of reminds me of a situation like Job's life, where God tests Job to demonstrate Job's righteousness, to demonstrate Job's faithfulness. All the while, Job is going through this test, not knowing what in the world God is doing. And when he speculates, he's more speculating with doubt. How can God be doing this? And you feel that hopelessness in the book of Job. And here With Abraham, he's facing a test from God. What is a test supposed to do? A test is something that you take in order to show who you are or what you know. I love taking tests. I just really I've never met a test that I don't want to take. I enjoy tests. And school, I love tests. I hated homework, but I love tests because I could take tests and not work too hard and do okay. Homework, you actually had to do the work. Also, I could take the test really fast and I could just sit and read a book through the rest of the class. So I love test days. When we did the standardized tests, I loved those test days. I mean, today, I'd take the bar if they'd let me, just because it sounds like fun. I love taking tests. I think part of it is a little bit of pride in me that I want to be able to prove that I know something. Maybe I'm smarter than I think I am. Maybe I'm dumber than I think I am. But at least I'll know if I'm one or the other if I take a test. I like it because it tells me who I am. It could be a stupid test, like, which character from The Office are you? I'm curious. Which one am I? I love taking tests. I don't so much love when God is testing me. Don't so much love when I am put in the crucible, when I am put in the fire to see what's actually happening in my heart. And here, that is what Abraham is experiencing. Now, Abraham's been tested before, and he hasn't always come out with flying colors. He's faced challenges and obstacles throughout his life, and throughout those challenges and obstacles, he has not always done what is right. Whether it's dealing in the chapter before this with King Abimelech, having his wife lie about being his sister, or dealing with King Pharaoh and also having his wife lie about being his sister. Hagar. Hagar's another example of this, doesn't look like Abraham is quite doing what he is supposed to do. Yet here he is going to face the greatest test of all. God has given him a promise. He gave him a promise many years ago that he would have a son. And he waited, and he waited, and he waited for years and years and years and years, and it seemed like God would never provide that son. This most important thing for Abraham, because Abraham is so defined by the way that God has promised to bless him, and the way that God has promised to bless him, all of it relied on him having a son. None of God's promised blessings to Abraham make any sense if he does not have a son. And so God promises to bless him, and finally the blessing of Isaac comes. This thing through which Abraham would have so much hope. In him, all nations would be blessed. How? Through his son. In him, he would have a great land. His son would enable that to happen. His son would enable great nations to come from him. And all of the expectation, all of the promises that God had given to Abraham, all found their fulfillment in this son, this most precious child. That's actually emphasized in the way that God talks to Abraham in verse 2. Then God said, "Take your son." If he stops here, it's a precious thing that God is demanding, right? A son. I have two. I love them both deeply. One of them has a birthday today, so that's exciting. We get excited because fathers love their sons, at least they should, and care for their sons. I still remember taking my son home, my first son, hadn't home from the hospital the very first time. This was when I realized that everybody driving a car was an utter maniac. Because this precious little boy is sitting in the back seat, and these fools around me do not recognize that they should be driving 25 miles per hour at all times because my kid is on the road. A father loves his son. But that's not all that God says to Abraham. He doesn't just say, give your son. That would be demanding much. Take your son, your only son. God had made a promise that would be fulfilled through Isaac, his only son, through his wife Sarah. This precious promise, this great blessing on the world. It needs a son, and God says, give your son, but not just the one of a bunch of sons. Give your only son. God's not asking Jacob to give up a son. He's got a whole bunch of them. God's asking Abraham to give up a son. He has one. But then it goes even farther. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. Go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. He asks for the greatest thing that Abraham could possibly give to him, his son, his only son, whom he loved. How could God demand this from Abraham? Well, I think there are several aspects that make this a unique situation. In the Old Testament, God is clear in his rejection of human sacrifice. That is not something that honors God. It is something that is actually forbidden by God, although the cultures around Israel had the practice of human sacrifice, of child sacrifice. God does not allow it for his people Israel. But here, he asks it of Abraham. Now, this is a unique situation. It's not what God ordinarily expects people to do, but this is Isaac. This is the unique gift that God has given to Abraham. This is the one through whom God said his promises would come. And so when he demands it, what he is really asking from Abraham strikes right to the heart of the promise. He says, give me back what I gave to you, what I promised I would give to you. And so as Abraham is going to be obedient, the New Testament says he has confidence that God would bring him back to life. Why? Because God had promised that Isaac would have become a great nation. Therefore, Isaac cannot die. Isaac cannot end. So it is based on the promises of God in this unique situation that God says, trust me with the promise that I have given you. And so Abraham receives this great test, and then he faithfully obeys. He takes the knife, and he takes the fire, the dangerous items, and gives his son the wood. Isaac carries that wood. As they walk, there is intimacy between the two of them, both verse 6 and verse 8. There's this emphasis of them going on together. Both before and after Isaac's question to Abraham, there's this emphasis on the togetherness of father and son, highlighting the intimacy. This is not a father who hates his son. This is a father who loves his son, and they walk on together. As the account progresses on, it uses geography to draw out the account. It starts by gathering the donkey and cutting the wood. It highlights the fact that Abraham actually has to cut the wood which he is going to use to offer his child as a sacrifice. Slowing down the process. It could just skip over that. Our account doesn't need that. It could just skip over it and say he got some wood, or just say that they went and just assume that we'll figure, oh, they brought wood. It's not a great mystery where they could get it. But no, the author is highlighting the progress of this account by slowing it down. He grabs the donkey, he cuts the wood, he travels for 3 days. Can you imagine that 3-day journey? Why couldn't Abraham just go to a mountain that's where he is? Why does he have to walk so far? Why does he have to travel so far? Why does it have to be prolonged? It's emphasizing the costliness and the faithfulness of Abraham as he follows through on what God has called him to do. They get to the place, they get to the mountain of Moriah. Perhaps the mountain of Moriah is Jerusalem. That is a name for Jerusalem. It could be another mountain. One of the challenges with it being Jerusalem is we already know that Melchizedek is the king in Jerusalem, so Jerusalem is settled at this point. So is it Jerusalem? Is it not Jerusalem? It's not particularly important to the story, but they get to the place where they are told to go. They leave the servants some distance away, and they start climbing the mountain together. The two of them walking up, carrying their load of fire, of a knife, of wood. And they walk up the mountain. As they're walking up, Isaac asked his father a kind of obvious question. Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. And they faithfully continued to walk up the mountain. They get to the top of the mountain, and it slows down even more. They get to the top of the mountain, and Abraham builds an altar. And then he takes Isaac and he places him on the altar. And then he binds him to the altar. And then he takes out the knife. And we reach kind of the climax of the story. Abraham faithfully walking every next step of the path. Continuing on, trusting that God is going to do something. Because God has made a promise that requires Isaac's life to be able to be fulfilled. So he is confident, he knows that God is going to deliver on that promise somehow. This passage does not talk about how Abraham feels. It leaves that up to our imagination. But we can imagine this is not a joyful path that he is walking. This is sorrowful and painful and heavy and fearful as he continues that slow, long process, 3 days walking, climbing the mountain, tying his son to the altar, building the altar, placing the wood on the altar, pulling the knife out of its sheath. One step after the other, Abraham is being faithful, and this is recounted in the New Testament as this great example of faith. Note that it's not how Abraham feels that makes him faithful. It is the actions that he takes and simply obeying the Lord. Sometimes in our life, we don't feel very faithy. We don't feel very optimistic and positive about what God is doing, but we can see here in Abraham's example that it is not how we feel about what God has called us to do that shows our faith. It is that we do what God has called us to do that demonstrates our faith. And Abraham demonstrates his faith through this long, slow walk, having confidence that God is going to do something. Abraham has seen a dead womb bring forth life. When Lot took the living ground, Abraham took the dead land, and he saw that bring life and prosperity. And now he anticipates that he's going to see a dead child brought back to life, according to the author of Hebrews. Because God will not fail his promises. So when God demands costly belief, that even seems like it strikes at the very core of God's ability to do what he has said. Abraham is so confident in God's ability to do what he has said that he can give God what God has given him. And so we get to the top of the mountain, Isaac laying on the altar, bound to the altar, a pile of wood, a pot of fire, and a knife in Abraham's hand, and then God steps in. Abraham, Abraham, 2 times, striking his attention. I don't think he needed to say it twice. I think Abraham was very eager to hear God intervene in this situation. But emphasizing God's strength as he comes in here. Abraham, Abraham. And Abraham responds the same way he responded at the beginning of the chapter. Here I am. The same way Samuel will respond in a few hundred years when God calls out to him. Here I am. Abraham eager and ready to listen. And God says to him, do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. Abraham has passed the test, and the Lord provides a substitute. Now, if you've read the New Testament and you read this account, it's hard to miss that there are a whole bunch of parallels between the cross of Christ and the binding of Isaac. We have to be careful, though, that we don't jump there so fast that we miss what the Bible is actually telling us is happening in this account. Because it's kind of interesting to me. The New Testament does not in any place mention this account as a type of the sacrifice of Christ. There are other events in Abraham's life that seem a whole lot more detached from what's coming, that the New Testament actually references back and says this is actually referring to something that Jesus did. In fact, in Galatians, it deals with the story of Hagar and Sarah. And there's this metaphorical understanding of Hagar as being a representative of Mount Sinai and Sarah being a representative of Mount Calvary, and how salvation doesn't come through the law. And when I was preaching on Hagar and Sarah, that passage really messed with me, because that is not what I see in the story of Hagar and Sarah. There's no Mount Sinai in the story of Hagar. How does Paul get there? It seems like if he wants a metaphor, if he wants something that's a type, he would go to Isaac, where God will provide himself a ram, and that'll preach. Where is the sacrifice? Your son, your one and only son, whom you love. There's all these images pointing us forward to the gospel, yet the New Testament leaves them there. I don't think that means they're illegitimate, but there is something that is more significant for us to get here, because there's another message that the New Testament gives to us frequently. Abraham is a model here of faith. Hebrews 11 emphasizes that this is what we're seeing in Abraham. We're seeing someone who has absolute confidence in the promises of God, and he is not a flawless example. He is someone whose faith has failed time and time again throughout his life, someone who has done things that seem to flow from a heart of utter faithlessness, having a child with his servant Hagar, giving his wife into slavery with Pharaoh and Abimelech. This is a man who's demonstrated faithlessness multiple times, but he comes to this mountaintop experience, this high point where God demands the most from him, and Abraham demonstrates his faith. He recognizes that God's promise is more important, more valuable, and more significant than even what he sees as the fulfillment of God's promise. That God is so faithful that he can give up Isaac, and God will still be true to his word. Sometimes as we consider what following Christ looks like, we wonder, what do I have to give up in order to follow Christ? Someone who's lost, someone who does not know Christ might hear the gospel and find an attractive story there. They might hear that, yeah, there's someone who dies for you, someone who pays your debt, someone who deals with your sin. That sounds great, but also I really like my sin. Do I have to give up on that in order to follow him? Do I have to give up? How much does he demand? Well, the story of Abraham tells us what Christ demands, actually. He demands everything. He demanded from Abraham that which was absolutely most precious and valuable to him. Abraham's faith was not some abstract feeling of confidence. It wasn't some religious piety where he just felt the movement of the Spirit in his soul and he just knew he could conquer anyone and beat anyone and do anything because he just felt so empowered in his faith. No, Abraham's faith was the painful commitment to trust God by taking one step after the other up that mountain, by continuing to obey when what God demanded seemed insane. And God calls us to the same faith as we follow him. God calls us to faith in his Son, even over other good and wonderful things, over gifts from God. He demands our faith even over our love for our family. Matthew chapter 10, verse 37, anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. When Jesus calls us to faith and trust in Him, He is calling us to acknowledge that He is who He says He is, that He is King, that He is Lord, and we place our faith and trust in Him over and against even those precious things that we love, our own family. He calls us to love Him over our own comfort. Matthew chapter 16, verse 24 through 26. Then Jesus said to His disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? All of the things of this earth, all of the comforts, all of the things that we love, all of the things that make us feel good, Jesus says, love me more. And God says that to Abraham too. Love me more than Isaac. Trust me more than the son that you can see as the fulfillment of my promises. I have made promises. I will deliver on those promises, God says to Abraham. He calls him to obedience and faith over everything else. In Romans chapter 3, Paul lays out some of those things that we might trust in. We might trust in our own righteousness. We might trust in our ability to accomplish what God has said and to do things, to be good enough, to be righteous enough. But in Romans 3 it says, there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands. There is no one who seeks God. All have turned away and they have become together worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. Their throats are open graves. Their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery mark their ways. The way of peace they do not know. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Paul there describes all of us. And we think that if we're righteous enough, that's going to be enough. But it wasn't Abraham's righteousness that was counted to him as righteousness. It was Abraham's faith. It was that simple act of trusting the Lord, of taking one step after the other. And so Abraham is a model of faith for us that shows that what God calls us to do, what God calls us to give up is everything. He is better than even His own gifts to us. He is worth giving up everything to follow. So Abraham serves as a model of faith. But we might look at that model of faith and think, how could we possibly do that? How could we give up something so precious? I cannot imagine giving up something as precious as a son. The only son, the one who Abraham loved. But the New Testament actually shows us that we have an even greater model than Abraham, and that we have a God who offers His one and only Son. In Exodus chapter 12, we see this kind of idea advancing with the Passover. And God takes the firstborn son of Pharaoh, but He also expects something of His people. Verses 12 and 13 of Exodus 12. On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. So God is going to come and He is going to demand the firstborn son. But He makes a way. He makes something available so that some houses He will pass over. Those houses that He will pass over are those who have the blood of a lamb that is shed in the place of their firstborn son. So in that first Passover, God is passing over Israel, but he's not just doing it for free. There is a substitution being made. A lamb must die to save the firstborn son. That continues on in chapter 34 of Exodus. Israel is commanded to redeem the firstborn donkey with a lamb. But if you do not redeem it, break its neck. Redeem all your firstborn sons. No one is to appear before me empty-handed. There is this idea of redemption that God owns the firstborn son that's carrying forward this idea from Abraham to the Passover, now on to Israel. And there's this idea of redemption and the offering and the substitute of a son. And then we get to the New Testament. In Matthew chapter 3, a voice from heaven said, at Jesus' baptism, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." Do you think that voice from heaven knew the contents of Genesis 22:2 when it spoke? Your Son, your only Son, whom you love. And as he declares from heaven that Jesus is the firstborn son, we are reminded of Abraham's firstborn son. God has a son of his own, and God offers that son as a sacrifice. John 3:16, which we read this morning, probably the most familiar text in all of Scripture, contains within it an allusion to our text today in Genesis chapter 22. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. He gave his one and only Son, whom he loved. Why? Because he loved us. God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. Paul picks up this idea in Romans 8 when he says, "He who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also along with him graciously give us all things?" How can Abraham make that greatest sacrifice imaginable of his son? How can God demand us to make the greatest sacrifices imaginable? How can God demand us to take up our cross and follow him, to give our very life, to love him more than we love our children, than we love our father, than we love our mother, than we love our brother, than we love our sister, to love him more than the comforts of this world, to love him more than physical prosperity, to love him more than everything? How can God demand that of us? Because he himself has done it beyond what we can even imagine. When he willingly sends his Son, his only Son, the one whom he loved, to die on a cross in our place. And so the echoes of the cross that we see in this account are real, they're true, they're part of it, but what they're showing is that God is worthy of our faith. He gives his precious Son, and so when he calls us to give everything for him, how can we hold on to anything? What do you need to give up to follow him? Everything. Because he is worth everything. And in his grace, when you fail and you hold on to things and you don't trust him like Abraham did, it is not your righteousness that makes you righteous. It is your faith that credits to you his righteousness. And so we follow after Abraham. We place our faith in him, knowing that everything that he has promised to us, he will bring to pass. And so as we've walked through Abraham's life, we've seen God give him promises and then put those promises under threat. And sometimes Abraham buckles with the threat. But here, at the end of his life, that ultimate moment when the promises were closest at hand, when it was most costly to trust the Lord, Abraham trusts the Lord because he had faith, because God is worthy of our trust. God is worthy of our confidence. Christians today, what are you holding on to? If you are a believer in Christ, you have already recognized, you have already proclaimed, you have already confessed that Jesus Christ, God's only Son, was given for you as a sacrifice. That is what you believe. Are you living in light of that belief? Or are you still holding on to things, thinking, well, maybe this sin is actually better than Jesus? Maybe this anger that I experience is actually more valuable than Him. Maybe that's the path to me receiving all of the good things that God has promised if I'm just angry enough. Maybe this pornography is the path to that. Maybe these sinful things that I love and hold on to, maybe this money is the path to that. God says, no, I am. I am your hope. I am the one who made the promises, and He calls us to trust in Him. But there may be some here who are not believers in Jesus at all. He has given a lamb for you. He has redeemed you. He has bought you at great cost. Trust in Him. He is good, and He is worthy of your love, worthy of your faith, worthy of your obedience. He is worthy of everything. So run to Him.